If we ask ourselves which central control system was pulling the strings throughout the 20th century, and even before, and if that power changed hands at all as a result of the Second World War, we'd be unsure as always as to who the controllers were, but we can say unequivocally that no such interruption of power took place. This then leads to a second consequence, that the tyrannical shadow power we face today is the same power base that Germany faced in the mid-20th century, or to put it a simpler way, as a consequence of Germany's defeat it allowed the controllers to reinforce their control. The bad is won. This facet of history is, unsurprisingly, hard for most people to grasp, given the plethora of indoctrination they've been bombarded with. But a frustrating aspect is that even so-called truth seekers seem to be unable to grasp this alternative view. They seem to actually want to believe the mainstream narrative, and therefore grasp at any crumb that might reinforce that point of view. They'll either rehash information that other researchers have already debunked, or more often than not, invoke spurious references to symbolism that is dubious to say the least. I'll explain this methodology in a way that hopefully makes sense. I'm going to introduce a principle that I call Malcolm's wristband to explain. There's a member of the truth movement in the Northeast called Malcolm, who is a down-to-earth, completely aware, awake truth seeker. He's been with his partner Helen for 30 years, and we all know he's straight as a die, without a homosexual bone in his body. Certainly not homophobic, but totally heterosexual and aware of all the false narratives fed to us. Malcolm is a very sporty type, and organizes hikes, and was a competitive cyclist before the insanity of the last few years. Now all of us in the movement know this, but imagine that someone claims Malcolm is both homosexual and promoting official narratives, because they came across a picture of him in a cycling event from 2017, wearing a rainbow wristband. Would we say this was insane, given everything that we know personally about him, or would we agree that he was a fraud, pushing this ridiculous gender narrative? Now I'd suspect the reason would be that Mal didn't understand the significance of that wristband at the time, but whatever the explanation, it wouldn't make us doubt every personally evidenced fact in favor of this picture. This, however, is how the occult brigade operates, where pictures and testimony connecting National Socialist characters with occultism is offered as evidential proof of Germany's connection with evil and the occult, with zero factual evidence whatsoever to reinforce it. So let's consider factual evidence of Germany's crucial part in 20th century history. When Hitler came to power in 1933 as Chancellor under Hindenburg, he enacted several priority policies. Laws were introduced making vivisection illegal, in other words, cruelty to animals was outlawed. Hitler himself was a vegetarian, loved children and animals loved him. He also closed down all the Freemasonic lodges and exiled the Rothschilds' banksters. There's even a tale that he made a senior Rothschild clean the floor of one lodge before banishing him. He even took Germany off the gold standard. More than this, he made Germany's wealth wholly dependent on the German workforce, as opposed to any tangible assets that could be defrauded by the banksters, which led to headlines throughout the world. Judea declares war on Germany. Essentially all German Jews were encouraged to become domestic terrorists to destroy the country from within, forcing Hitler to establish detention camps for those Jews hell-bent on bringing Germany down. Contrary to popular belief, not all Jews were confined in these camps, and thousands of Jews carried on business as usual, unlike in the West, where German and Japanese families were incarcerated in brutal conditions. The fabrication of the Holocaust would take a hefty tome in itself. Suffice to say that the phenomenon in its entirety was a total fabrication. To mention just a handful of points, in the 1980s Ernst Zundel, a German emigre to Canada, was imprisoned for publishing literature denying the Holocaust. This in itself should have people infuriated, yet the censorship of open debate seems null and void on this particular subject. In the wake of his imprisonment, however, the Leuchter report was commissioned, where Fred Leuchter, who was uniquely qualified as an expert on gas chambers, being responsible for the construction and maintenance of American execution chambers, traveled to the sites of these supposed death camps. He carried out carefully documented, forensic analysis, whereupon he concluded that the official narrative surrounding their purpose was impossible. He would repeat this assertion when asked his opinion on Holocaust survivor stories. The Anne Frank story, even though proven in court to be fiction, is still commemorated as a national holiday in America, and there's the incentives of volunteers to claim money from the Holocaust Fund, needing merely a letter saying you knew someone who was a victim to qualify. Anyone wishing to know more can research on social media platforms that will actually allow a balanced view. When we're aware of the satanic, occult conscripts that the cult used to perpetrate their hold on humanity, we find that they have certain rules to follow. They'll exhibit hand gestures, or at the very least avoid the subject of Christianity, which they hate. How is it then, that we have multiple records of the National Socialist hierarchy, Hitler and others included, who speak of their love of Christianity, hatred of occultist practices, and make reference to their satanic enemy? How many people are aware of Hitler's relentless offers of peace, both in the lead-up and during the war, honoring unwritten pledges not to attack civilian targets, only responding when the Allies ignored this and committed horrendous atrocities against German civilian targets? How many people are aware of the satanic connections of the leadership of every Allied country, controlled by the banksters? This episode in his story is one so fraught with deception and propaganda that, only by abandoning preconceived indoctrination, can you genuinely arrive at a balanced conclusion. We've discussed the erasure of history and the brainwashing that controls the slave society we exist in. A society that hasn't always been here, and seems, to all logical conclusion, to be a state of humanity that has existed only for about 200 years. It's hard to comprehend how this mass deception has been achieved, but is this largely through their successful dumbing down campaign? What I mean by this is, if we take the mainstream narrative, then imagine someone living in a forest in the Middle Ages being shown a cell phone with all of its capabilities, from communication to watching videos. Could that forest dweller comprehend to any degree this technology, or simply see it as magic? They would likely imagine us as spirits from another dimension rather than being the same as them, and so could this cult simply be humans who've deprived us of our natural abilities to the point where we can't comprehend their plan as being humanly possible. The issue I have with this is the combination of their sick and twisted, non-human indulgences, like pedophilia and cold, calculated sadism. This harks back to my skepticism of psychopathy. Is it a human trait, or has it been introduced into popular culture to deceive us into thinking that way? In my opinion, everything seems to point towards a separate species of human, and the truth of the physical world where we live, allowing for other lands from where these entities could emanate. Have we even seen those responsible? There are beliefs that our societies are ultimately controlled by 13 bloodline families, and I believe that certainly whoever or whatever is orchestrating this, works in the shadows, but the dilemma of whether these entities are human like us or from somewhere else entirely is debatable. From a biblical aspect, we'd see this cult as being spirits somehow, and in this event there'd be no physical character to point to, but rather a demonic spell cast on those weak enough to be affected by it. The Bible speaks of Satan's little season, and I think that religious texts are another aspect of this mind control mockery, where truths are hidden in coded, poetic form, telling parables that represent historical events or paths we should follow. The capitalist system is essentially a system that ensures slavery, with rules deliberately built into it to elicit the lowest instincts in us to create a dog-eat-dog environment. People who are successful within this system become so because they've exploited the majority of people, but excuse their exploitation as being sanctioned by the rules, thereby excusing their actions by delegating their responsibility of care to someone else. If a businessman makes a dozen people redundant at Christmas to reap a financial reward, those businessmen will thrive who don't consider the moral consequences of their actions, and everyone affected is then subliminally encouraged to recoup their losses by handing on their misfortunes to others. As long as it's in the rules, then it's not my fault, right? All of this is supported by the mantra that you only go around once, and you have to do whatever you can to enrich yourself in this life, encouraging the cult of egoism, where celebrity is lusted after and encouraged. Even when you die, not only does your burial have to be paid for, but any slave debts you had are passed on to those still living, probably those you loved and cared for in the slave world. Don't think for a moment that one country is free and another in enslavement. All countries work together, analogous to an organized crime syndicate with different chapters spread across the world. The idea of international competition is simply part of the theater. In the West there was capitalism and in the East communism, two experiments to see whether greed or totalitarianism would be more practical, and it appears that the time is now ripe technologically for worldwide totalitarianism. There is a prophetic work that's been in literary circulation since at least the 19th century, and although its true provenance may never be known, and is disputed by those wishing to hide from the truth, its threats and warnings have all come to pass. It contains a particular passage referred to as the Secret Covenant, and is generally known as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. This sinister work holds the chilling narrative of promises to poison our children and subjugate all of us under their total control in graphic detail. Those promises seem to be coming to pass. As we move toward 2025, there's a feeling that all the chess pieces have been maneuvered into position ready for checkmate, and in the simplest nutshell possible, this is how they've achieved it. The legal entrapment, although completely null and void, is used against those who've successfully been tricked into assuming they are obligated to obey its rules. Institutions have been established by the cult, supported by false truths, to convince them of their validity, and staffed by the weakest members of society to support them. These weak members of humanity are teachers, nurses and doctors who've allowed the lies preached by the cult to be accepted as true along with the media. Then there's the forces personnel who've obeyed orders to enslave and attack us, largely enforced by the police, and the legal system that sits on top of all of it, implementing humanity's enslavement for their puppet masters, spreading the myth that governments are autonomous. By far the most potent of these is the media. Fantasy can be portrayed as fact in theatrical productions such as Hollywood movies, documentaries and news items. This way they've convinced a public preoccupied with surviving the 9-to-5, that the environment is dangerously warming due to their actions, that potential malevolent assaults are imminent from all sides, both domestic and foreign, with staged events to scare them into giving up any weapons they might have, and that they therefore need the unquestioning protection of authority.